Hello, CP.
Hey, Jeremy. How's it going today?
It is cold outside. I'm actually realizing. Let me shut my window. It's like I'm here freezing with a jacket on. I'm like, oh, my window's open. Maybe that's why. So yeah,
Could just have a teensy bit to do with it.
just a little bit. So, how are you? How's your week been going?
It's going. It's been an interesting week. We're finishing up legislative session, and it's my daughter's spring break, so get to juggle both of those things.
Yes, juggling kids and policy work does not seem like a fun activity, I will have to say.
Yeah, I mean, juggling kids is hard because they have like arms and legs that do their own things, and having multiple in the air at the same time.
I'm now thinking about like Cirque du Soleil, just some kind of, what do they call that? Like when people rhythmic gymnastics with each other?
Like acrobatics.
Yeah, that's a simple word. Yes, acrobatics, exactly. So, all right. Well, thank you to everyone who is tuning in today. Definitely has been a busy few weeks. Something that I know I'm learning is that the majority of policymaking appears to happen in the very last week or two of session. And I think I was talking with someone about this, I think yesterday, of like, it feels like, I think in general, people kind of trend towards procrastination. And so I think when you get, hundreds and hundreds of people together, and then I think that kind of allows for this like procrastination to kind of snowball into what legislative session turns out to be, which is, even though there's been ample time to work on some pieces, suddenly you find yourself last minute trying to triage and fix and change things. So,
and that's really why we ran into a lot of issues last year. If people remember, the legislative session was cut early by about 3 weeks. So all of this time at the end of the session where everyone sort of intended to get to the stuff that they'd been putting off, it was cut short, and there wasn't time to get through a lot of things that should have passed last session. Not just our bills, a lot of people's bills.
Yeah. So you bring up a great question. So I know a number of these bills that we have are left over from last session, but what did we actually accomplish? Like, what did we accomplish last session? I don't know. I can't really remember actually.
So the biggest thing that we got done last session, which was actually pretty huge, and I was extremely happy we were able to get it done before the end of the session, was creating for the first time non-discrimination rules in access to healthcare and health insurance. There was one bill that covered like healthcare, that covered discrimination by like doctors and hospitals and licensed medical professionals. And then there was a bill that covered discrimination by health insurance companies. Both of those passed, and those were huge because prior to that, Maryland did not have a statewide comprehensive healthcare non-discrimination law. There was a law that was decades old that prohibited racial discrimination by hospitals and by nursing homes, but didn't cover other protected classes and didn't prohibit racial discrimination by, like other medical professionals. So if you were like a family practitioner, you could discriminate. Or if you were working in a, huge institutional clinic with like hundreds of employees, you could discriminate.
Yeah.
There was no law prohibiting that at the Maryland level. So that was a huge victory that we were extremely proud of. And it became especially important when the Trump administration early in the summer last year moved to revoke the Obama era protections in healthcare for LGBTQ folk. So that meant that we had some protection at the Maryland level. And in fact, we knew that that was coming, and that's why we pushed the Maryland law so hard to ensure that there would be a continuity of protections in the state, regardless of what happened at the federal level. So that was one of our big victories. The other thing that we got done last year was a repeal of the state sodomy law.
Yes.
The final repeal was a little bit different than what we had hoped. There was also there's a related provision that ended up remaining in. It's not technically called sodomy. I'm forgetting the precise language off the top of my head, but it ended up remaining in there. It's not enforceable as to consensual sexual acts between adults in private. Um, there's like 3 qualifiers there. Oh, sorry. There's a 4th qualifier: consensual, non-commercial sexual acts between adults in private. So if it meets those 4 things, then it's not enforceable. And in fact, that had been the case with the sodomy law for years, but we were just very opposed to we were very opposed to sodomy being a crime in general, because it's so it has such a horrible history of being targeted against LGBTQ folk. And it does remain, or it did remain enforced in some ways. Again, non-consensual, commercial, sex acts involving minors, sex acts in public. There were situations in which it was used against people. And I personally was very opposed to any queer person, regardless of the circumstances, ever being charged with sodomy. I just found that inherently offensive. Like, maybe they committed a different crime that, we can debate as to whether the other thing should be a crime also, but like, I was very opposed to anyone ever being charged with sodomy, any queer person. So that was another victory. Again, it was relatively small because the law wasn't enforced as to, the things I laid out since the late 90s. I know we had a few other bills that passed. They are escaping my brain, but we did have a few things that got through. And then we had a few things that were looking great and then didn't have time to get through the Senate.
Like panic defense.
Like the panic defense.
Which we almost ran to that same exact issue this year, where it seemed like everyone was kind of forgetting about it. And I know we did some poking it's like, all right, let's I think we had gotten word that until JPR had done police reform, that they weren't going to take up anything else, and they said they were only going to take up like anything that was like unanimous, right? And so I was like reminded them that panic defense ban was unanimous in the House, and it will likely be unanimous in the Senate. So y'all should take it up. And then they did. And then Friday happened. Do you want to talk a little bit about Friday, CP?
Yeah. And so heads up, I was out of the office on Friday again because it's my daughter's spring break. So we were actually at the beach, and I was not watching.
You weren't watching our C-SPAN voting session?
I was not, amazingly.
Yeah,
I was on the beach uncovering my daughter who had buried herself in sand repeatedly. Yeah. It was exciting. Not quite as exciting as the JPR hearing that you got to watch. But Jeremy has briefed me on this, and I've also had extensive conversations with some of the legislative aides and such who were involved. And so I can give you the quick summary of what went down, and Jeremy can interject to correct me that I'm getting wrong. But basically, we had the initial hearing on the panic defense bill in the Senate in early February, and then nothing for like almost 2 months. And again, as Jeremy just said, it's because like they'd been focused on the police reform bill. There's other things that have sort of been like their priorities, the big contentious things that they've been arguing over as a committee, trying to deal with, and sort of leaving a lot of the smaller bills for later to sort of be like, well, we can deal with that quickly at the end.
Yeah.
And I understand how that happens. Now, having gone through that last year and seeing session end early and bills die because of that, it still made my heart flutter a little bit. But but I was fairly confident that this session was not going to end early and that we're going to be okay. And so finally, we got the panic defense bill back on the schedule last Friday. And we're very optimistic going into it that, everything's going to be okay. They're going to talk about it. They're going to vote it out. Maybe someone will say something stupid, but it'll be okay. That's not exactly how it happened. Now, I'm going to give you a slight spoiler that the end of this story is good. So don't get too worried as I start delving into what happened on Friday. So on Friday, we had a senator who has not always supported our community, who decided it would be a great time to contest whether the panic defense was a good idea, or whether the repeal of the panic defense was a good idea at all, because as he said, if you were in bed with someone and suddenly discovered they had different genitalia than you were expecting, that you would, of course, feel entitled to attack them and, hit them and force them out of your space, and et cetera, et cetera. He basically advocated for
to have a panic defense.
Yeah, he basically advocated for like trans panic violence in the Judicial Proceedings Committee. I'm not going to name names. You can watch the video from last week and see it. But yeah, it was not great. Now, after that, we then had some Democratic senators who also expressed some skepticism about the bill, including one senator who is also a defense attorney and who was worried about sort of the implications of the bill, especially because it ended up including protected classes beyond sexual orientation and gender identity. So I like to think that her concerns came from a good place of like, let's make sure there aren't issues here. But to some extent, she was definitely egged on by the Republicans on the committee who were sort of encouraging her to find flaws with the bill. Ultimately, she requested that the bill be held over until this week so that she could have some time to look into the implications of it, explore the language, review the cases that we had identified, and sort of come back and say, okay, I either see what's going on here and it's fine, or I have some issues. So I had a conversation with Jeremy in the car coming back from the beach on Friday afternoon, in which we covered all that had gone down, and we had a fair bit of strategizing and trying to get things arranged. I had a long conversation with a staffer from Senator Lamb's office early this week to cover a lot of the potential objections and the responses to them. We tried to get a lot of meetings scheduled and things to sort of alleviate concerns. Ultimately, so the bill was then, in large part because of Senator Lamb's pressure on Senate leadership. And I really want to thank Senator Lamb for his hard work on this bill. In large part because of his push, JPR promised that there would be a vote on the bill this week. Initially, they had said the vote would be on Monday. It ended up not happening Monday because their voting session went until like 11:30 p.m. They were talking about the police reform bill like the entire time. Like they basically just never got to it. And at a certain point, they're like, I know we said we were going to vote on this thing today, but it's just not happening. They did bring it up later in the week, though, at their next voting session, and it passed out of JPR. It went to the Senate floor, and it's gone through second reading on the Senate floor. It's still waiting the final vote, but passing the second reading is usually indicative that it will ultimately pass. So we're waiting to see what that final margin is going to be, but it looks like it will pass sometime within the next few days. And then it will be sent to the governor at the end of session. So the end of this long drawn out story is that we were very scared for a few days. We were worried that we were going to have to like call out the reinforcements and have everyone start calling their senators and be like, we need this to see a vote, and please vote on this, and queer lives are important, and all of the stuff that we would say. But fortunately, we were able to avoid that. It was kind of close though. So things are looking very good. it should be enacted into law by the end of this session. And, it ended up being a good story, even though, again, I was basically having a heart attack over the weekend.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a few things I think that came up for me. I think one is just, I think one of the challenges for a lot of folks that were watching that voting session was to kind of hear, these transphobic comments, or more or less having someone justify trans panic assault. And so I know folks definitely were feeling a little frustrated to like that sort of exist or be thrown out there in that space and it not be rebutted, right? And so, for me, it's something that I'm kind of reflecting on too, is like, when we look to our legislators to kind of be allies, and I think the Senate, is definitely the Senate. It definitely is lacking in representation for LGBTQ community. I think Senator Mary Washington is the only out legislator in the Senate. And unfortunately, she's not in, JPR, which is where apparently where all of our bills end up, unfortunately. But it just kind of raised questions for me of like, at what point, do we look to our legislators to kind of stand up for us in these spaces, either before or even after the fact? And I have to say, like, I was really, just to kind of reiterate, like, I think Senator Lamb, I think really kind of showed what it means to kind of be a good sponsor. Like if you've, taken on a piece of legislation that you're responsive when issues occur and not really sort of rely on, the advocates or the community, right, to kind of do all the footwork. He really was critical in just making sure concerns were addressed and to get it through. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I mean, CB, I'm interested to hear your thoughts because you've been in a few more, you've been here longer, but is this kind of, I think compared to like the past two sessions, right? Do you feel like this type of grandstanding in voting sessions and hearings and things like that, is that new or common or?
Well, so we certainly had a senator, a different Republican senator in JPR last year, who during the sodomy repeal bill, just decided to ask some incredibly offensive questions about whether the advocates for the bill were in favor of sodomizing children. And at one point, there was a representative from the State's Attorneys Association who was there in support of the bill, who was saying, this is, all of your examples are things that are already illegal, in the rape and sexual assault laws. And the senator was, hitting on that. And he's like, can you show me where in here, where in the rape law is that illegal? And the state's attorney representative replied with, all of the rapes. It's illegal under all of the rapes.
Any rape is illegal. Like,
yeah. And yeah, it was just like, we got to the point that he had to be like, no, this is like every single sexual assault law, prohibits what you're talking about. And he just would not let it go. So I have seen that sort of grandstanding. I will say though, that there's a very different feel to it when we're able to be in the room and able to respond versus the hearings where we can't be there at all.
Yeah.
So for people out in the world who are less familiar with this process, these bills, they have their initial hearings where there's the ability for members of the public to testify on them. And FreeState frequently is testifying as part of the panel put together by the sponsors for the bills, certainly for the bills that are helping the LGBTQ community. So, the sponsors will reach out to us, they'll reach out to other organizations, and they'll try to put together, a sponsor panel of, 3 or 4 people that are, they're experts on the issues. And so, when we're in those initial hearings, we have an ability to, frame the bills, to answer legislator questions, to advocate for the community, and to, be a presence in the space that to some degree does lessen people's willingness to make certain types of arguments. For instance, I think that well, are you saying it's okay to sodomize a child? Argument we saw last year could have gone in very far more offensive directions had we not had queer advocates at that table, who the senator had to, stare in the face while asking these questions. And the session on Friday, on the other hand, was a session, it was publicly broadcast, but it was a session that there was not an opportunity for the public to speak. There was not an opportunity for the community that this bill affects to stand up and say, no, like what you're saying is horribly offensive. And so we really do rely on our allies in the legislature in those moments, because there are spaces that we cannot go into. There's spaces where we can physically be there, but we cannot speak. And so it's critical to have those allies, and it's critical to maintain those relationships, which can be very frustrating because sometimes our allies are not particularly great allies. Sometimes they're fabulous. And, some people are fantastic. And there's some legislators in Annapolis that I just adore. And there's other people that, there's some bills that we work on with them and it's fantastic. And there's other bills where we're just arguing with them. And, ideally everyone would be like Senator Lamb or Delegate Moon in the House, the very fabulous delegates and senators who, they reach out to us when they're thinking about things, last year, Delegate Moon scheduled a meeting with me where he was like, so I did this thing several years ago. How's that going? And I was like, I am so glad you reached out to me because here's some issues with it, with what we're seeing. And he's like, oh yeah, let's get that fixed. So fabulous conversation. But then there's, other people that, they support us some of the time, but they don't necessarily push back when people are saying just the horrifically offensive stuff. And I understand that, they have to maintain their relationships too. And so, there's constant things, but, it's really why it's important for, to have members of our community in the legislature.
Yeah, and I think for me, that reminds me too, we testified there was a bill in the House to reduce the age of consent for mental health services. So not prescriptions or anything like that, just access to therapy from 15 to 12, because that's kind of what research suggests, that, youth should have this access. And for youth, it's hard, or it can be more challenging if you're have concerns around, having to notify your parents, especially if your mental health concerns are related to sexual or gender identity. And you may not have a school counselor that you feel comfortable going to, or you may not have, your parents to kind of set you up with someone. So this was a really important bill. And I just remember in that, in the way that session is done this time, it's the panel in favor testifies first, and then there's an opposition panel. And so, and when that happens, we're kicked out of the Zoom room, right? So we're just, again, not really there. We're just watching opposition through YouTube, right? Kind of say whatever they need to say. And again, whether that is other delegates or opposition, they kind of have very problematic takes on certain things. And I remember that session, someone was kind of just going on this rant about, transgenderism, in his language, being just a fad for youth, and that, this is just a scam to indoctrinate youth into transgenderism and for mental health providers to make more money and things like that. A lot, right? A lot of bad stuff. I'm at a loss right now. Which committee is Delegate Belcastro on? Do we recall offhand? I'm forgetting.
So the bill that we heard with Delegate Belcastro was in Health and Government Operations, but I am not sure which committee she herself is on.
Yeah. Well, so it was great to have her in the room as an out queer person, because she was able to immediately kind of respond and sort of center herself like as a queer person, to kind of rebuke, the opposition in a way that I found to be refreshing, right? Because it's one of those things of like, it would have been different, right, if there was a member of the LGBTQ community in in JPR to be there to rebuke, some of these sentiments. And so I definitely agree that, representation is important and matters, because it is just really in these like spaces where there is significant power, and important to have folks there that are willing to kind of, stand up. So.
So if you are vaguely interested, people
running for office
in the world,
get in touch with us. We would love to see how to connect you with folks that I know there's a number of different national nonprofits that are focused on enhancing LGBTQ representation in legislatures. So there's definitely resources out there.
I personally have lived in Maryland for like a hot second. I mean, it's been like 4 years at this point, but like, and I've lived in Prince George's County for like a year and a half. So like, it's not going to be me running is what I'm saying. So I'm relying on you out there to be the ones to bring the queer rep to Annapolis.
Yes.
The A and LGBTQIA is Annapolis.
I like that. We should change that.
I mean, no offense to the asexual and aromantic people out there. That's really what it is. It's asexual and aromantic, but I'll add a second A for a second IA for in Annapolis.
Yeah. In a much earlier former life, I used to work with the Penn State's LGBTA Student Resource Center, but the A there stood for ally.
Of course it did.
Yeah, but I think it's since changed their name. So the only other thing that was kind of interesting that came up for me during that session, our voting session, Senator Lee, she, because there were a lot of questions about the expansion of the scope of this, and I know we felt, I don't say indifferent, I'm not sure that's the right word, but in the effort to sort of include additional sort of protected classes around panic defense, I think there's a piece of me that can kind of like make sense, in terms of the ways in which racial bias can trigger feelings of like fear and or anxiety or what have you, right? And so, for me, I was kind of trying to think through like, maybe you aren't quote unquote discovering that someone is like Black and that is like motivating you to respond in a certain way, but there still is the reality that, white folks have internal biases where they do perceive Blackness and have fear, right? And so, that was like where I started going down in this like rabbit hole in my head of that. And then I think Senator Lee made some good comments too about, sort of in the context of anti-Asian, violence that is rapidly increasing around the country. And she kind of talked a little bit about that too, of just like how, is fear of like the coronavirus and things like that, is that like, again, are there these motivating factors along lines of race? And so, and then I'm stuck in my head thinking through too, is like, well, has anyone ever used that as like, well, I guess not, because that's, anyway, I don't know. Yeah. My head was just going down the rabbit hole there, but I guess, I don't know if I have a question there, but.
It is interesting because last year, when this bill was in the House, the House Judiciary Committee insisted on adding in, initially the bill was just sexual orientation and gender identity. Mm-hmm. The House Judiciary Committee last year insisted on adding in other protected classes in order to create a level playing field for everyone, basically. It was like, we don't want to create a special rule for queer people. We just want to prohibit this generally. And they came to us at that time and they're like, is this okay? And we were like, we haven't seen evidence that this has happened in the world in any recent time. But also the records in these things are terrible. Like for a whole lot of reasons that I talked about in my testimony, if you want to look it up when I was talking to, JPR in February. But just because we can't point to something doesn't mean that, it should be okay to, kill someone because you discover that they're Asian and freak out. That said, it's interesting because the Judiciary Committee in the House basically was like, we really want this in. So it ended up in the bill this year. We believe that it helped the bill achieve unanimity in the House. That without that, had it been focused only on sexual orientation and gender identity, there would have been more opposition to it from certain conservative elements. Interestingly, that then became a big question in the Senate, where in JPR, where people were concerned, well, you're adding in these other protected classes that are outside of the core purpose of the bill. And, you know, we're worried about unforeseen, like the unforeseen sort of snowball effect, blah, 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 blah. And they're not wrong to some extent, but also it's like, but that's the language that the House wanted added in. And now, like, so it's sort of, you know, trying to work with two different bodies that sometimes have different views on things, and you know, trying to achieve that consensus can be fun. I know that sort of that railed off into just the word fun, but
definitely keeps you
on this Friday afternoon.
So thanks, CP. So I guess for me and the ones, the policies that I'm tracking, it's definitely been a busy week for, you know, we've kind of had these two kind of emerging developments or issues. You know, the first being still really looking to address the death of a trans woman in a Baltimore City correctional facility while she was housed in a male cell. And we're still, you know, trying to get answers for the family. And so, you know, we were able to get an organizational letter, you know, turned around, you know, addressed to the Division of Public Safety and Correctional Services, so DPSCS, really calling for sort of the you know, release of a full incident report with the family, because they have yet to receive any answers. And then there were some additional kind of points of really wanting to get a grasp on what their current policy is, and have them sort of be, you know, host a reform, you know, and kind of bring in affected stakeholders to kind of advise and, you know, reform the policy. And then sort of lastly, to establish, you know, some liaison within DPSCS to kind of oversee said policy and its compliance and implementation. So kind of ensure that, you know, our incarcerated siblings are, you know, that their rights are still protected and they're still kept safe. You know, I think it's definitely been challenging kind of navigating this space. So, you know, we were able to get an organizational sign-on letter, and we had a meeting with Secretary Robert Green with DPSCS, the head of DPSCS, on Tuesday. You know, Aya Damons, the executive director of Baltimore Safe Haven, you know, she's the one who was able to kind of get him to the table and to really share and, you know, kind of the ideas that we had worked on. And I have to say that I am, you know, tentatively optimistic. They seemed open to collaboration on updating things. It was good to kind of hear them acknowledge that, you know, gender and sexuality and sort of the best practices and working with LGBTQ folks changes and evolves over time. So that was you know, it was good coming into that for them to acknowledge that, you know, they want to make sure that they're doing their best to keep current with you know, the community and our concerns. And so, you know, it was a productive conversation. It was a great step one, and we definitely are looking forward to kind of continued work in that space. You know, we'll be working to reach back out to organizations that signed on, try to kind of get a working group, you know, trans folks and folks with experience with incarceration, to really kind of lead in that space as we kind of conduct a policy review and provide recommendations back to DPSCS at some point next month, and kind of see where it goes from there. What, you know, for us though, we still have a lot of questions and concerns around the death of Kim, and I know that's something that we're going to continue to push for to make sure that the family does get answers. You know, it's been over a month now, and they still haven't completed an incident report, and they still haven't even determined or shared cause of death with the family. And so just to kind of give folks an update there on that case. And, you know, now that the family has an attorney, you know, we'll definitely be following them and trying to support any advocacy work that they have moving forward. But So that was one quick update. And then in parallel, we've had the Inclusive Schools Act, a lot of issues that kind of keep popping up. And so that same voting session that we had the panic defense ban come up, SB 98, the Inclusive Schools Act, which is non-discrimination policy for all publicly funded K through 12 institutions across the state. That was put on hold by one of the senators. And what kind of quickly developed was that, there still were a lot of concerns from a single religious entity that I shall not name here, based out of Montgomery County, that was able to retain a lobbyist and work kind of quickly to kind of stick some sticks in the gears. Is that a good metaphor? How do you muck up the gears? What's the metaphor I'm looking for? I'm not sure. Trying to trip the bill. Gosh, I'm so tired. I'm not good with my metaphors today. But more or less, what kind of became clear is that, there really is an effort. I think we made a lot of great efforts over the past 2 weeks to do compromise, to kind of find a middle ground. And we actually adopted amendment. We adopted favorable positions on an amendment, that would help address some of these concerns. But, it's one of those things that like you kind of fix one thing and then there's like you get back and there's like 10 other things that need to be fixed, right? And so it kind of became clear as the clock runs down that this may or may not just be an effort to stall the bill out. And so where we are now is, we're seeing significant delays from Senate leadership in bringing this bill to a vote because one individual and a single kind of religious entity, really are wanting it to go their way. So they don't want to bring it up to a vote until they can make sure that it's positioned in a way that is favorable to them and this stakeholder. So, but, we've been pushing out, a lot of material this past week. Definitely we're really excited to see MoCo LGBTQ Democrats, Annapolis Pride, and MoCo Pride students really kind of step up to put pressure on some senators that were holding this bill up. They just finalized and sent an organizational sign-on letter to the Senate President, Bill Ferguson. There's still a lot of concerns. We were told that we had to wait for police reform to get done for it to come to a vote. Police reform has been finished, still wasn't on the vote list for this morning. And so we're going to continue to push and really call that, where we're there. We've, either we kind of move forward with the amendments that we've agreed upon, or you don't adopt any amendments, but we need to see movement on it and we want votes on it. And so that's just going to be kind of the language or message we're going to be pushing out to folks to make sure that, this doesn't get delayed and put off until it's too late for it to become law. So stay tuned this weekend. I know some folks are organizing a tweet storm this afternoon. So if you are very good with Twitter, you can follow some of the hashtags around Pass Inclusive Schools or MGA 2021. I forget do you know the hashtag for? I probably should have prepped myself to look. See, I'm not a Twitter person, so that's why I'm definitely looking to these student groups and other folks to really kind of lead that stuff. But
I am a Twitter person, but I've been not tweeting about the legislative session this year.
Yeah, which makes sense. We can only do so much in our capacity as a 501c3 when it comes to advocacy work, and so
and that's why sometimes on these calls I say things like I'm not going to specifically state who was annoying me or whatever.
Yeah. As much as I'm here for transparency, there is there's kind of a tight rope to walk, and so that's where we, I don't know. It's interesting because I am kind of thinking about that too. It's there is this weird, what I quickly learned is there is so much that goes on behind the scenes in legislative sessions and deal making, and who is it that can is positioned to really peel back that curtain, right? And even though we try to do some of that here, there's only so far I think we can go into doing that as well. But yeah, so inclusive schools, I think where we're at for everyone, it's like the issues really are coming down to this idea that for schools that are private schools and they receive public funds, some of these publicly funded programs require you to sign an agreement or attestation that you will not discriminate against students based off of a large number of protected classes. So this is something that's like present in like the Boost program or the textbook technology program, a handful of others. However, there are still buckets of other public funds that go to schools that don't necessarily have the same framework or requirements. And so, it's really important for us that if they sign an attestation, they can, post a copy of that attestation in their student manual. That really does the work. However, we still want to make sure that even if a program isn't have attestation as a requirement of it, that there still is a developed and maintained non-discrimination policy in line with the use of public funds. And that's kind of where that's like the sticking point, just this like develop and maintain language, right? That the act of developing just anti-discrimination policy and actually having to like write out the words sexual orientation or gender identity when you don't believe that these things exist is a conflict of religious expressions, right? That's kind of the base argument. Our kind of counter to that has been, that's fine, no one is forcing you to, we don't want you to have to do something that's against your religion. So you don't necessarily need to participate in the public funding program, if that is the concern. And so, we've gotten to a place where this is it. It's either you only apply for publicly funded programs that have attestations that you sign and you can post in your manuals, or if there's other funding opportunities you're looking for, public funds you're looking for, the development and maintaining of the non-discrimination policy. And so, I think for me, the frustrating part, and part of this is that, we spent so much time and energy really trying to protect LGBTQ students as they exist in private schools that are publicly funded, that I think a lot of people are missing that the first half of this bill is about public schools across the entire state, right? So we have like upwards of, 1 million plus, students, that are, non-white, that are disabled, that are LGBTQ, et cetera, that are really poised to really benefit from this in their public education systems. But for us, we didn't, and I could just say personally, like as someone who went, I was a low-income person that was benefited from public funding to go to a Catholic school. I went to Catholic school for 12 years. I can just definitively say that I would have preferred to have gone to an institution that had a clear non-discrimination policy and had a much safer and inclusive and affirming environment. And so I think that's just a position that, I know for us as advocates, I wasn't really willing to let go on. I didn't want to leave out, the LGBTQ students that are in these private schools, because I was one of those kids. Sorry. Sorry, it was a long week. But yeah, it just, I think it sucks that, and I think this is something we, kind of share with the senators of just talking about, I think it's different for adults, right? Because you have some layers or levels of autonomy and, being able to choose the spaces that you're in. But, sorry. You're able to choose the spaces that you're in, but for kids, you a lot of times don't have a choice, right? It's what your parents, where they want you to go. And sometimes the way where they put you is not, a safe environment. And so, yeah, that's why for me, it's kind of important that we really make sure that, all kids, all kids that are benefiting from public, in institutions benefiting from public funds are, know that they're protected, that they have access, that, they should exist in environments that are non-discriminatory and should definitely have access to and knowledge of, that's the environment they exist in. I think I look back to FreeState when we did our needs assessment in 2016, it's just very clear that students did not have safe learning environments, that the majority of queer students experience bullying and harassment. Majority of students would not report these incidents because they didn't feel safe doing it. And a minority, like only 10% of these students were aware of any sort of non-discrimination policy in their schools, let alone any sort of mechanism to address it. And so, I'm really hopeful that this bill does a lot, not just for school students in public schools, definitely in maybe more remote areas that, in some districts, we have great policies in, like Baltimore City schools and Montgomery County schools, right? But, we don't necessarily have these in some of the other counties. I'm not going to name counties. I don't want to, denigrate any counties, but, it's hard work to kind of school district by school district go and establish these policies. And that's really why this legislation is so important. It just sets a clear standard across the state for all students, so.
Yeah,
I hope it gets passed.
And it's definitely an area where if you do private schools receiving state funds at the same time that you set the baselines for public schools, it's possible in a way that coming in later and trying to be like, okay, now let's talk about just the private schools receiving state funding. Like, that's a very different discussion in the legislature. And so, we've been trying to keep these connected and not let opponents divide the two issues, because at the end of the day, it's, how are students being treated, and are they having their basic human dignity respected by the institutions that the state is paying to educate them?
Exactly. So yeah, we'll see. I'm trying to be optimistic. There's been rumors that there's opportunities for voting sessions to start on Saturdays. As of yet, I'm not aware of SB 98 popping up on a voting list for JPR. And so we really are going to be looking for folks to make sure that, they contact their senators, and specifically the Senate leadership, for Ferguson and Will Smith and Walt Stryker, to really make sure that this bill happens, and that it gets the vote, and that we don't let, opponents run down the clock on this, because of the potential to really have huge impact. I mean, even if you want to be like, even if we want to just look at HRC and its scorecard, this is the one kind of big glaring omission that we have. Even though we had the Fairness for All Marylanders Act back in 2014. 14, thank you. Education was a clear exemption in that bill. And this is the work we're doing now to correct that kind of exemption that was put on the table back in 2014.
Now, talking about scorecards,
we have one. It's ready.
We've been working on a Maryland legislative scorecard that I don't think we're quite ready to launch, but
yeah, I've been waiting for things that make sure everything gets on the Senate floor, right? I want to make sure it gets out of committee first, and then just remind folks that we're watching,
Yeah. So we had hoped to get this out prior to the legislative session, but because of a lot of things, including the pandemic and the switch from our prior executive director, Mark Procopio, to Jeremy, and other things, like it ended up not happening prior to session. But we have I'm told it's quite beautiful 2020 legislative scorecard.
Did I send it to you to look at yet?
You may have, but if you did, I didn't look at it.
Okay. Let's talk about that after the call. We can take a quick look at it. It is beautiful, and I think Ezra had some feedback on it, but nothing substantial. So yeah. It's pretty much done. So,
but yeah, so that will be going out soon, and then we'll also be continuing with one, after this session is over, for what's happened this session. Yes. And the hope is to, start demonstrating to Maryland legislators that there is someone paying attention to what they're doing on queer issues. And, that if they want to have that 100% free state justice rating, that they should vote on positively on queer bills and not like stonewall things.
Yeah exactly. So, and the inclusion of committee votes, I think, is something that wasn't something that was in the last legislative scorecard, but I'm recognizing now the importance to kind of even lift up or highlight the work that happens in committees, especially as we consistently run into issues with bills getting stuck in committees. I think we'll also probably be introducing metrics to look at folks that are sponsoring our legislation, because CP, you and I, we this was a struggle, I think, in November to find sponsors for some of our bills.
We had a very special problem this year
Yeah.
where, because of the pandemic, in the Senate, well, so both in the House and the Senate, people were given limits on the number of bills they could sponsor, but it really hit us on the Senate side because their limit was 25 bills, but there's 1/3 of the number of them as there are House members. So all of the House members were like trying to find senators to co-sponsor their bills, and they were all hitting their limits rather quickly. And so, we had a number of bills that were like, okay, we need someone to help us push this through the Senate, but everyone that are our normal, great allies, they already had their scorecards. Their dance card had been filled out, 3 minutes into the start of the dance, to use a Jane Austen era reference.
Thank you for explaining that, because the dance card went over my head. So thank you.
And so we were looking for people who were very interested in the issue and still had the space to do it. And we saw that a lot of legislators were, they would have reserved those last few spots, but they were like keeping them open for something, very special. And so there were a number of legislators we talked to who were like, we're very in favor of this thing, we love it, but it's just not the thing I'm going to put in my 25th slot.
Yeah. So yeah, definitely I'm going to probably introduce some metric of that. And then I think the other thing too is start tracking when things are getting stuck or dying in committee. Because I think, the pandemic obviously kind of highlighted this, and I think this session has even more acutely highlighted this, of that, I think someone has shared with me that certain committees, in our Senate is where, progressive legislation goes to die. And I feel like people are not as aware that the committees, the kind of the power or role that they play in being able to move things from, I think having floor votes is one thing, but just the power to even kind of, be a stopgap for what gets to the floor, right? And so starting to track of all right, so how many of our pieces of legislation died in these committees, right? And that way, these committees that are being held accountable for not taking up, our priority legislation. And so that's definitely going to be, I see that that's going to be important to make sure we do for our 2021 sort of session legislative card this summer. So,
yeah, I will say that JPR certainly in the past had that reputation of being the place that progressive legislation went to die. Senator Smith, who's now the chair of JPR, has been doing a lot to try to push it in more progressive directions. So it's not nearly as bad on that front as it once was, but it can still be a tough battle.
So yeah, I guess on a party note, what's really left, we'll be pushing through the weekend and making sure folks are, contacting at least Senate leadership. If not, even go ahead and contact your senators as well and give them a heads up that you care about inclusive schools and you want to see SB 98 become law. We'll be kind of firing all cylinders beginning of next week, just to make sure that all of our senators are supporting this legislation. It would be great if we got this to be veto proof. I'm not optimistic yet that we will be able to have a veto proof majority for this bill, and so there's still a lot of different hoops or questions, right? What happens if Hogan, who will likely veto this bill, what happens next? So definitely come back next week, see how much has changed in a week's time. Because next week, do you know when presentation is, the deadline or that date?
To Hogan?
Yeah.
It's something like 5 days after the session ends or something like that. So the last day of session is the Monday after next, and then they'll basically, in most cases, most bills, they just sort of give to him en masse at the very end of session. So, and then he'll have 30 days to review them. So basically by mid to late May, we'll know what has been vetoed.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm looking at, I just found I'm going to read this article I just found about, there's actually a nice little outline of Maryland's General Assembly process. So definitely do that.
But yes, return to us next week, same Zoom time, same Zoom channel, and you can hear our exciting updates on what has happened.
Which I hope we have great news for. So anyway. All right. Well, thank you, CP. You have a great weekend.
Bye, everyone.